All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to August MDA Advocacy Institute. My name is Michael Lewis, and I am the Director of Disability Policy here at MDA. And the focus of tonight's Advocacy Institute is Know Your Voting Rights. As you all know, the midterm elections coming up this fall, so we're going to give an overview of voting rights as it pertains to people with disabilities. Next slide, please. So tonight we're gonna go over introductions of our panelists and some housekeeping items. We're gonna give a broad preview of the 2022 election. Professor Elizabeth Pando is going to give an overview of what our federal voting rights protections are. And then Stephanie Flynn from the National Disability Rights Network is going to give an overview of how to protect your voting rights as well as some helpful voting resources. And then finally, we will have time at the end for Q&A. Next slide, please. Public housekeeping items at the bottom left hand corner of the screen. You can click the CC button with the bubble around it to enable closed captions. And then on the right hand side of the screen, you can click on the chat bubble to ask a question during Q&A. Next slide, please. So tonight, these are the panelists you're gonna hear from. Professor Elizabeth Handel, who's a professor of law at the St. Louis University School of Law. Also used to be head of the Disability Rights section at the American Bar Association. Correct me, Professor Pando, if I got that wrong. We'll also hear from Stephanie Flint, who was a public policy analyst at the National Disability Rights Network. And then, as I already said, I'm Michael Lewis, and I'm the Director of Disability Policy here at MDA. Next slide, please. So, a little bit of an overview about the upcoming 2022 election. Election day is on Tuesday, November 8th. All 435 members of the United States House of Representatives, as well as 34 United States Senate seats are up for grabs. In 36 states and in 3 territories, they will be electing a governor on November 8th, and in addition, 46 states will hold elections for one or both of the houses of the state legislature. Next slide, please. Voter registration is already underway. There are links, and this webinar is being recorded, and it will be made available after the Advocacy Institute, and we can probably post some of those links in the chat. You can go to the National Conference of State Legislatures website and find your state voter registration drive voter registration deadline, rather, most states it's within 15 to 30 days before the election. And if you go to www.vote.org, you can find information about when early voting begins in your state and what the qualifications are for voting early in your state. And then, of course, National Voter Registration Day is coming up on September 20th. So if you are not already registered to vote, we strongly encourage you to get registered. Next slide, please. This here is a map of all the U.S. Senate races that are up for election in November. The light gray states are the states that do not have a U.S. Senate election this year. The red states are the states that the Republican Senate candidate is predicted to win. The blue shaded states are the states where the Democratic candidate is predicted to win. And the darker shaded gray states, namely Pennsylvania and Arizona, is where the race is leaning toward the Democrat. Wisconsin is leaning Republican, and then Nevada and Georgia are technically tossed up, but lean Democrat as well. Next slide, please. These the same concept, the states stated in red are the states where the Republican gubernatorial candidate is expected to win. The states stated in blue are where the Democratic candidate is expected to win. The darker gray shaded states, Nevada, especially, are states where the election is considered a toss-up, and then the light gray states are states in which the governor is not up for election this year. So this is a great way to know who's on the ballot in your state. Most definitely the member of the U.S. House will be on the ballot, and possibly a governor's race, a Senate race, and state and local races. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to hand it off to Professor Elizabeth Hunter to give us an overview of federal laws protecting the right to vote. Professor Hunter?
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for holding this event. As we have national conversations around elections and the right to vote and attempts to restrict the right to vote, it's critically important that people with disabilities are included in that conversation at all levels. So what I'd like to do is just give you an overview of the federal laws that promote and protect accessible voting. So next slide, please. So you've probably all heard the figure that 1 in 4 adults in the United States report living with some kind of disability. What you might not have heard is that people with disabilities are about 1 in 6 eligible voters. At least they were in the 2020 election. That's about 38 million people, right? So a significant number of voters. And that's according to a report done by Lisa Scher and Douglas Cruz at Rutgers University, who have done research on voting accessibility for years, if you're interested. And the report also found that although voters with disabilities are a significant share of the electorate, people with disabilities in the past have been less likely to vote than people who don't have disabilities. And there could be many reasons for that, but one of the reasons for lower voter turnout is definitely barriers at the ballot box. So part of the challenge of ensuring safe, private, and independent voting for everyone is the diversity of disability, which you can see on the slide here. People with different disabilities experience a range of different kind of barriers, right? It could be an intellectual or developmental disability and voter eligibility. Could be issues with voter registration, which in some states you have to do at the DMV, which means you have to get transportation to the DMV, and the DMV building has to be accessible. Voter information may not be communicated effectively. And then, of course, accessible voting methods, which you'll hear a little bit more about in the next presentation. There's also barriers to in-person voting, which many people will still want and need: transportation, physical access, accessible voting booths and equipment, independence and privacy, and perhaps the biggest barrier of all, training of poll workers so they understand the right to vote, how to use accessible machines, etc. So if that's the big picture of the barriers that people have reported, what are the federal laws that apply to accessible elections? So next slide, please. Well, the biggest one, and probably the most obvious one, is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. You're probably all familiar with this law, but just as a quick reminder, the Americans with Disabilities Act provides a clear and comprehensive national mandate for eliminating discrimination against individuals with disabilities. It prohibits discrimination in a range of areas of society, employment, public services and activities, public transportation, private businesses that serve the public, and telecommunications. The one that's most relevant to elections is Title II, which you see in the slide here. That applies to public entities, which includes states, cities, towns, all the municipalities at the state level and below. The ADA protects individuals who have a physical or mental condition that significantly limits a major life activity or a history of that kind of condition, or who are thought to have that kind of condition. And this definition of disability was broadened in 2008 by Congress, so it's meant to apply to as many people as possible. So the thing about Title II of the ADA is nothing in the text of the law actually talks about elections, but it does apply to everything that states and localities do, and that would include administering elections. So they are required, the big overarching requirement is ensuring that people with disabilities have a full and equal opportunity to vote. And they might go about ensuring this in a variety of different ways, but certainly it includes physical access to places where you might register to vote, or you might actually vote, whether that's in person on election day or early voting processes. It includes ensuring effective communication. That one pops up a lot with voting and election materials. Are they available in large print? Are they written in a way that's understandable? At in-person polling places, is sign language interpretation available? And then there's also a requirement to make reasonable accommodations to individuals' specific needs to make sure that they can enjoy equal access to voting. And the Department of Justice has published some guidance on how the ADA applies to elections. If you're interested in seeing that, it's at ada.gov, G-O-V. There's a checklist for accessible polling places. There's information on common problems with parking and walkways and other kinds of barriers. So next slide, please. The second law that you hear quite a bit about in terms of securing the vote is the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Oops, my slide said 2022. It's actually 2002. And it goes into more detail about requirements than the ADA. It specifically provides that voting has to be accessible for people with disabilities, and that includes non-visual accessibility for individuals who are blind or visually impaired. It requires that polling places have at least one accessible voting system in federal elections. And according to the law, an accessible voting system is one that allows people with disabilities the same opportunity to vote privately and independently that others enjoy. This often means accessible voting machines. So they have to be present, they have to be in working order, and ideally the poll workers have been trained on how to use them. Next slide, please. Then there's some other laws that address very specific barriers, right? The two that I mentioned, HAVA and the ADA, more broadly apply to elections. And then there's some laws that provide very specific protections. The Voting Rights Act requires officials to allow a voter who has a disability to receive assistance from someone of their choice. It doesn't require anyone to use assistance, but if you'd like to, you're permitted to rely on the person of your choice rather than a poll worker, and that's to preserve the privacy of your vote. It also prohibits conditioning the right to vote on literacy tests of any kind, which were very commonly used to suppress votes of people of color and people with disabilities in the past. The second is the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. That requires accessible polling places or accessible means of voting for people in federal elections, right? So the overview we got, some of those are federal elections, some of those are state elections. That turns out to be very important. And also the National Voter Registration Act. That's to ensure that people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to register to vote in federal elections. Next slide, please. Oops, did I say next slide? There it is. Okay, so those protections are great. Some might say they don't go far enough, but those that exist are quite strong. Unfortunately, despite these legal guarantees on the federal level, we have plenty of evidence that barriers still persist. There was a 2017 report by the GAO where they actually went and surveyed over 100 different polling places to determine how accessible they were. And they found that 2/3 of them had at least one kind of impediment to people with disabilities to voting. A lot of those were physical impediments, right? No parking, poor paths from the entrance to the actual polling place, lack of ramps, etc. But there were also other kinds of barriers. Most polling places that they looked at had at least one accessible voting system, but about 1/3 of those had one that didn't allow for private or independent voting, right? That required a poll worker to assist someone with voting, which does not give an equal opportunity to vote because we are guaranteed the right to a private and independent vote. And the report also noticed that the Department of Justice's guidelines that I mentioned earlier weren't really clear about the extent to which or how the Americans with Disabilities Act apply to early in-person voting. We know that they apply to in-person voting on election day, but it's a little bit less clear exactly how they apply to early in-person or other voting methods prior to election day. And we also know that people with disabilities report, all sorts of other barriers, inaccessible election and registration materials prior to the election, lack of reliable transportation to polling places, and problems securing specific forms of identification increasingly required by more states, which you'll hear about a little bit later. Next slide. Please, thanks. There is some good news on the horizon. Pursuant to an executive order about accessible voting, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, created a report finalizing recommendations on removing barriers to voters with disabilities. And this just came out in March. There's a link at the bottom of the slide if you want to see the report. And it provides some insights and recommendations for how to increase accessibility for voters with disabilities. First, they sort of canvassed, all the literature and reports on systemic barriers to voting for people with disabilities, and then developed a set of recommendations to address those. Those recommendations include specific examination of voter registration and national mail voter registration form. Right, they took a look at the form itself and how it can be accessed to ensure that that could be accessible. They also looked at voting by mail, which we know makes voting more accessible for a lot of people, including people with disabilities. They looked at using in-person voting technologies, voting at polling locations, and of course, poll worker training. So we have a very well-developed, quite recent set of recommendations to improve accessibility of voting. And I think to take away from this is that there are federal guarantees to a safe, private, and accessible voting, but there's still problems. There's lack of compliance and lack of enforcement. So these federal laws and federal rights are powerful tools to protect and promote voting rights for millions of Americans with disabilities, but they have to be enforced to be effective. There's lots of opportunities to strengthen these laws in ways that could increase voting equity, like clarifying the application of the ADA to methods of voting other than in-person voting on the election day. And we also need to keep them in mind as we begin to confront the wave of state laws that would present barriers to voting for people with disabilities and others, which we'll hear about next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pender. That was great information. Next we have, and by the way, if you do have questions for Professor Pender, we ask that you wait until the Q&A session at the end. Next up we have Stephanie Flynn, a public policy analyst at the National Disability Rights Network. Stephanie?
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. It's great to be here with all of you. So just to kind of give you a preview of what I will be talking about, Michael and Mark actually asked me to talk a little bit about what the National Disability Rights Network is, NDRN is, what the protection and advocacy systems are. Of course, we're going to be talking about ways to get involved on the state level. And here we go. So essentially, what is NDRN? So essentially, we are the membership organization for the state and territorial protection and advocacy systems. We like acronyms at NDRN, so we call those P&A systems. And P&As are congressionally mandated. They were mandated 3 or more decades ago, which essentially means that the network, as we call it from time to time as well, can pursue legal, administrative, or any other remedies under state and federal laws in order to fight for and protect the rights of people with disabilities. And of course, this does extend to equal access to the vote. There are 57 P&As. There's one in each state, of course. There's one in the District of Columbia, and there are P&As in all of the territories, and there's also one that serves the Four Corners region of the Southwest. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the role that we play in protecting voting rights for people with disabilities at the state level. So, of course, we did talk about HAVA earlier. It was passed in 2002, and it included lots of provisions that, obviously were included to make it easier for all Americans to vote, including those with disabilities, and make it more accessible for everyone. One of the things that it included was the authorization of funding for the Protection and Advocacy for Voter Access, or as we call it, again, we love acronyms, the PAVA program. Now, the PAVA program is what allows the state P&A agencies to advocate on behalf of voters with disabilities on the state and local level for elections in order to ensure equal access to the vote, and not just the vote, but all aspects of the voting process. So how do we do this? People, excuse me, P&As work to provide disability training for poll workers, distribute resources on ensuring accessibility of campaigns. So for individuals who may be trying to make their campaigns more accessible, maintain voter hotlines so that individuals can report various issues. I know that this is something that is also done with some organizations on the federal level, but of course, this is something that we do try to do on the state level so that we are able to, or the network is able to talk with the elections board officials. They also examine polling places for accessibility. And what this essentially means is going in and taking measurements and looking to make sure that there is access, equal access to a voting machine, an accessible voting machine, among other things. So those are some of the ways that the P&As, more common ways rather, that the P&As will go about looking at voting in their states and protecting the rights of people in their state with disabilities. Next slide, please. So I know that we briefly went over these earlier, but I really just want to bring this home because I feel like a lot of the time when you talk with your boards of elections officials, oftentimes, the federal law is often forgotten and wrapped up in state laws. And so I think that it's a good thing for individuals to kind of remember that in a lot of states, you are doubly protected. And so, we've obviously experienced a wide array of challenges when it comes to the vote. Even now, some of the challenges here can be the prejudicial assumptions about individuals' capability to vote, particularly those who may have intellectual and developmental disabilities or mental health disabilities. So ensuring that we continue to work to eliminate those barriers. Of course, physical access barriers, we kind of talked about that earlier as well. If somebody can't get into the polling place, then they can't vote in said polling place. Not having access to a ramp is something that can be definitely a make or break type of thing. Blind and low vision folks, or those with other print disabilities, a lot of the time can't cast their vote because the one accessible voting machine that is required by HAVA in the polling place is either broken, or the poll workers a lot of the time don't understand how it operates, or it's unplugged, or just a number of things. I've definitely heard stories about individuals in the blind and low vision communities, waiting hours and hours and hours to vote. And, not everybody has those hours and hours to wait, but of course they're waiting so that they can get that accessible voting machine. So just kind of more ways that, the network works to try to eliminate those barriers, and tries to also monitor and investigate and see where those breakdowns are. So some laws that do protect your right to vote, of course, we've talked about HAVA. It requires jurisdictions to have at least one accessible voting machine in each polling place for federal elections. This includes a right to a private and independent ballot, which is provided to voters without disabilities. Sometimes you'll see with the accessible voting machines, unfortunately, and I've definitely actually seen this when I've gone to vote. I'm actually a blind person. And I've seen where the ballots of individuals with disabilities that come from the accessible voting machine look different from the ballots of people without disabilities. And so at that point, if individuals are sorting through ballots, they're going to know, oh, these look different. These are probably disabled voters' ballots. Oh, these look this way. This is probably a non-disabled voters' ballot. So that is definitely something that has been problematic. And we do continue to see that, but fortunately, and we'll go over this a little bit in a minute, we are working to try to fight that as we can. Of course, the ADA provides protections to individuals with disabilities, similar to those that are provided to other minority groups. Of course, it requires all components of the voting process to be accessible, including registration and casting of ballots. Of course, we talked about, or Elizabeth rather talked about Title II and how that is what covers voting and how that provides equal access to the vote. So again, things to kind of remember and keep in the back of your mind, especially if you do plan on, and again, we'll talk about this a little bit more later, going to your elections officials and advocating for voting rights in your state. Of course, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 requires that you do have the option to have assistance if you're blind, low vision, or if you have another disability. Oftentimes we see that individuals who are blind or low vision usually end up taking that option if they want it. Most commonly take that option, I guess you could say. And we also have seen that some with the elderly as well. Like Elizabeth said, it cannot be your coworker and you cannot be conditioned into a vote. The Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984, of course, requires physical access to the polling places. Again, that's where the P&As come in order to monitor, investigate, and to work to enforce that by taking measurements of polling places and just kind of surveying and ensuring that those places are accessible to people who use wheelchairs or individuals who have other physical disabilities. Of course, the Registration Act, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 requires that public offices or places that provide public assistance or receive funding to provide those that provide benefits to individuals with disabilities must provide people with disabilities with the opportunity to register to vote in their state. And I honestly think that this is something I sometimes have seen this and I sometimes haven't, but I do know that I actually ended up having that experience when I was in the state of Mississippi, where I'm originally from. They actually asked me if I wanted to register to vote when I was getting vocational rehabilitation services. So if that's not something that's currently going on in your state, I definitely would try to bring that up to various offices if you're able to advocate for those offices to provide those services to individuals with disabilities, not just because it's federally required, but because it's the right thing to do. Next slide, please. So there, we have some resources, and I think that either Michael or Mark is going to put them in the chat. And so a few of the recent published resources that we have that I would like to call your attention to. There is a statement that NDRN put out with a few other disability groups that is called, that basically, it's called the Accessible Voting Systems are required by federal law. And it's essentially an easy to read, digest fact sheet that's signed by multiple national organizations that lays out the requirements that elections officials must follow. We did this in the wake of the primaries because we were hearing about individuals or states rather that were wanting to take away accessible voting equipment in lieu of just using hand-marked paper ballots. And so that was one of the reasons that we went ahead and put this statement together, so that if individuals or if the network runs into this, this is a one-pager that can easily be pulled out. Another thing that I want to call your attention to, and again, Elizabeth might have had a source similar on this slide, but there was an article on ada.gov that essentially gives very brief summaries of all of the applicable federal voting laws that we talked about earlier and that have been talked about in various points during all of our presentations. And it also gives some guidelines that elections officials should follow and best practices. So again, I definitely encourage you to check that out. And if you feel it's applicable, feel free to, share that with your elections officials. Another link that I went ahead and included is I wanted to ensure that, if you want to keep up with what NDRN is doing on the national level, this is a link where you can do that. You can keep updated by visiting that website and looking at the About Our Work section. And if I'm not mistaken, the link actually will link you straight to that. So I guess after this slide, next slide, I think that the next slide is my contact information. But I don't know if anybody has any questions or if I should just turn it back to Michael.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much for that. This is a question for you before we go into the Q&A. Can you tell us a little bit about the laws that different states have passed since the 2020 election to restrict voting access because of erroneous claims of election fraud, and how those have impacted access to the vote for people with disabilities?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there have definitely been a number of laws that have come up in the wake of course, 2020's election, and then, of course, after 2020's election. So during the aftermath of the 2020 election prompted many states to try to put together more strict voting laws as it pertained to just voting access in general. And of course, as we know, voting laws, particularly, I'll just use Texas as an example, voting laws restricting, early access to the vote and various things can obviously harm minority groups such as those with disabilities. So we've definitely seen an uptake in those types of things, which has been kind of disappointing to see that individuals are, it's interesting. Of course, these provisions were originally put in place because of the pandemic. But as we all know, making voting accessible for people with disabilities can make it accessible for everyone. And we saw that during the pandemic, during the election seasons. We saw the vote by mail, we saw more access to early voting, we saw electronic ballot return. So we saw a lot of those things. And so sadly, we have seen some states roll back those types of things. However, we've also seen some good things. I won't just be a gloomy person over here. But during the 2020 election and during 2021, a lot of states actually started replacing their outdated voting equipment and upgraded their accessible systems, which I'm not sure if any of you guys have ever used an accessible voting machine, but some of them are definitely, I guess you could call them well-loved more than others. And so a lot of states are doing that, which is really great considering that voting technology, as we know, has rapidly continued to evolve. So we definitely love to see, the voting systems being upgraded in order to ensure that the accessibility keeps pace with the evolution of technology. Two states in particular that we know of, and super excited about this. Georgia and Pennsylvania are hoping to eventually get have all accessible voting systems, which means that all voters, regardless of disability, will use accessible equipment, which again, I talked a little bit about the secret ballot a little bit earlier. This will make it to where, individuals with disabilities ballots won't necessarily look different or feel different versus individuals without disabilities. So we definitely are super excited about that. Louisiana and New York are also coordinating with the network, which is super exciting, and our partner organizations as well, regarding their expertise on these types of issues as well. So hoping to see some good developments out of that. Multiple states have actually worked with the network to improve their vote by mail systems as well, which is really exciting. A lot of the recommendations that we gave them were they were implemented in a lot of the states, and they included implementing electronic ballot delivery and remote accessible vote by mail, among other things. And 31 states currently, and include as well as DC, currently offer some form of electronic ballot transmission. In states that allow people with disabilities, there are 10 of them to utilize that, which are Colorado, Delaware, Hawaii, Maine, Nevada, North Carolina, North Dakota, Utah, and West Virginia. So, I feel like we're seeing some rollbacks, but I feel like we're also making some progress as well. And so I think that that's also something that, we got to take the victories where we can get them for sure.
Now, Professor Pender was definitely, I know a month ago there was a lawsuit by disability rights groups in the state of Wisconsin related to a new voting law in that state. Can either of you speak to that?
I probably can't speak to that at this point, just because I do more of our public policy work. But if you'd like me to connect you with somebody offline who may be able to speak better to that, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you. Well, why don't we go ahead and open it up for Q&A if anyone had a question for either Professor Pendo or Stephanie.
Hey everybody, this is Mark from MDA. I got a couple questions privately chatted to me, so I might just pop those out. One for both of you is kind of a practical question. So if I know that I need an accessible voting machine, or I need to make sure my polling place might have a ramp or an accessible entrance, is there a good way to where should I go to find if that's available, or how could I find that available? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is Stephanie. I can go ahead and jump in. One thing that I would do, most states have of course, they have their state board of elections, but they also have their local boards of elections oftentimes. So I definitely would recommend maybe contacting your elections commissioners. They might be able to tell you, give you that information. And so I think that that's something that could easily be done. Now, unfortunately, the only way to know for sure is going to be getting there, which of course, as Elizabeth was talking about earlier, transportation can definitely act as a barrier. So that would be something that I would recommend. Another thing is, the Protection and Advocacy Network, of course, is happy to assist in whatever way. And so a lot of the PNAs have voter hotlines in each state. And so if that is something that you would be interested in trying to find out, it's possible that they may have the answer. Of course, I can't promise that because things can be state to state specific. But I think that those are definitely two avenues worth exploring in order to figure out, the accessibility of the polling place.
Great.
Yeah, those are both excellent recommendations. And if this is something you're thinking about, especially in terms of contacting your local board of elections, doing it sooner rather than later could be important because, as you sort of gathered from what we've said so far, federal law provides rights of access to different parts of the voting process, but state laws fill in other requirements and actually implement state and local elections. And as Stephanie pointed out, oftentimes state and local election officials are very focused on state and local election law and requirements, and maybe lose sight of or are not as focused on the overarching federal guarantees of equal access to voting. So if you anticipate you might need to open up that conversation, having that earlier rather than later could be a benefit.
Yeah, I agree.
And if I may say, I believe that one of the links that Mark put in the chat at the beginning of the presentation had a link that you can click on for each state to contact the State Board of Elections. So that link it's in the chat. I believe it's a vote.org link that shows the period for early voting state by state. If you look all the way to the right hand column, there should be a link to contact each state board of elections. So if you need that information, that's a great place to find it. Any other questions for Stephanie or Professor Pendo?
Michael, we actually got another one that popped in to the chat. Maybe I'm the one that can see it, but it's from Monique, and she asks, why would ballots be different for someone who has a disability as compared to someone who doesn't? I remember, I think, Stephanie, you said they look different, they were different. Why might that be?
That's a really good question. So oftentimes individuals without disabilities are hand marking their ballots, depending on the state that they're in. So that definitely can have an effect on it. Obviously, individuals who are blind or low vision are not hand marking their ballot, they're pressing buttons and they're pressing print on like a Scantron looking cart. Sometimes the way that the machines are manufactured, the cards for the accessible voting machine, I've actually seen them be a lot bigger versus the regular sized ballots. And I think a lot of that can also be attributed to the fact that a lot of these voting machines have not been upgraded in quite some time. Again, we've seen voting technology continue to evolve and evolve very rapidly, but unfortunately the accessible voting machines have not really kept pace with that technology. So I think honestly, those are probably two of the main culprits behind that.
Yeah, and just in my experience voting here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the accessible voting machine, the mark your choices on a touch screen, and then it prints out those choices on a narrow, Scantron like piece of paper, and it is much narrower than a standard ballot that you fill out by hand. The regular ballots in Virginia tend to be about that wide and yay long, and then the flexible voting machine ballot tend to be about that wide, about the width of a business card, a little bit wider and very long. So there definitely is, at least here in Virginia, a marked difference in the size of the ballot. So but to your point, whoever's counting the ballots, feeding them into the tally machine automatically knows, oh, this was the voter with the disability, which kind of would defeat the whole purpose of a private ballot. So, any other questions?
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Michael. And just to kind of add to that, one way I know that a lot of individuals, on their mind is, how can I be involved? How can I work to, help in this? One thing that I've actually seen, and I absolutely love this, I've seen a lot of individuals without print disabilities actually go in and request to use the accessible marking devices. That way, there are more ballots of individuals with disabilities versus some without. And so kind of seeing that, if you're trying to get involved in terms of allyship, that's one small way to make a big difference.
Another question we have in the chat from Michael, are there any helpful info in getting absentee ballot to be permanent? I believe that most states do allow absentee balloting, but the requirements and criteria can differ remarkably from state to state. Some states allow anybody to request an absentee ballot, whether it's because they'll be out of town the day of the election, or they can't take out work, or whatever the reason may be. Other states have very stringent requirements to vote absentee. It's really a state by state situation, correct?
Yeah, I know my home state of Missouri does allow absentee balloting, but in extremely limited circumstances. And even if you get an absentee ballot, you still have to deliver it in person. You still can't mail it in. Now, I don't believe that that restrictive law was created specifically to suppress the votes of people with disabilities, but it will have the effect of suppressing the vote of people with disabilities and many others. So that's one of the challenges of voting accessibility, is that there is this federal overlay, but then there's so much variety amongst the states, and it becomes a state by state advocacy issue to bring attention to laws that restrict or suppress accessible voting and to have those changed.
So, in other words, there's no federal protection of absentee balloting as of now.
That's right. The ADA requires that voting, it has like a broad overarching requirement that voting be accessible, but does not necessarily explain in detail what that means. The Department of Justice has said if you have early voting or vote by mail or absentee balloting processes, those have to be accessible to people with disabilities. But it doesn't say that you have to have them or what they have to look like. And that is actually a big gap in the law, because we're seeing now that those kind of options for how and when to vote are extremely important to ensuring accessible voting for people with disabilities and many others.
Absolutely. Any other questions for a panelist?
None have come in, Michael.
All right. Well, before we go, we have one announcement that we'd like to make, Mark. The MDA Advocacy Department has announced MDA Advocacy Collaboration Grant. We are currently accepting applications for a nonpartisan advocacy campaign to receive legislative and public policy victories at the state, federal, and local level. So if any of you guys have an idea of an advocacy campaign to improve voting access at the state or local level for people with disabilities. You were heavily encouraged to apply. Other possible projects could be vital research projects to provide much needed data, opportunities to convene stakeholders in the neuromuscular disease community through in-person and virtual meetings, conferences, and other events. Programs a toolkit to build, grow, and fund neuromuscular disease advocates. Another innovative program campaigns initiatives that can measurably impact one or more of MDA and the collaborative organization's common advocacy goals. The deadline for these grant applications is September 15th, so that's coming up in just a little bit over 2 weeks. We will be awarding grants up to $25,000 and perhaps more at MDA discretion. So if anyone in our audience would like to submit an application for a grant, you can visit www.mda.org/advocacy grant. And Mark has also put that link in the chat if you want more information. Well, that concludes the August Advocacy Institute. We want to thank our panelists, Professor Handel from St. Louis University Law School, and Stephanie Flint from the National Disability Rights Network. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.